This video is on David and Goliath and godly yet sometimes deadly women of the Bible. There is somewhat of a relation. It's something to do with war with at least some of the women. But let's start out with David and Goliath. And the reason we're going over this at all is because I always hear people or see people make flippant remarks about something they claim is in the Bible, and they don't get the details right, and they don't get the context right, and they try to infer or imply things that are simply not impliable from the context if you read it. So let's dig right into this. We're going to start in 1 Samuel 16, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that take a couple of little side trips as we go along here. So King Saul was the first king of Israel, and we see here that God has sent the prophet Samuel to anoint a king to replace Saul, who had gone bad. We'll learn a little bit more about Saul later, but I first want to read through this chapter. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he concentrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He's tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. And then it says about David in this chapter, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord had tormented him." And we can see, look at the footnote here, a harmful spirit. So it isn't necessarily, I just lost my web page. I thought it opened a new page. So let me go back there to 1 Samuel 16. Whoops. 1 Samuel 16, and we'll get back to where we were. Sorry about that. Saul's attendants said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes upon you, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them to his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Whenever the Spirit of God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul, he would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. Bunch of interesting things there. The first thing is that when Samuel goes on his way to anoint the next king, he's afraid of being killed by Saul if anybody hears about it, so God makes up a cover story, which is interesting. It's not the real reason Samuel is going where he's going, but he made up a reason. which is interesting when it comes to the question of lying. And I'm surprised that more anti-theists haven't brought up this incident for that purpose. That's because they don't know the Bible, and the people they get their Bible snippets from apparently have overlooked this. If some of them have, maybe they've caught up, but it's been years since I looked at any of the anti-theist Bible sites. But it's an interesting question to ponder, and I won't go into that here. It's not my topic today. So they have this cover story. And the next thing is, God says, I don't judge by appearances. I don't judge by the flesh. I judge by the heart. We see this also in the New Testament in James, where James says that God doesn't play favorites. So, and God is not a respecter of persons, so to speak. So, what does that do to the issue of flesh-based hierarchy taught by many Christians? How can it be that God is more a respecter of persons and changed from looking first at the heart in the New Testament compared to the Old? If God was judging by the heart, and he does this throughout the Old Testament, where he chooses not what society would choose, but the last person they'd choose, time after time after time, why would he in the New Testament suddenly switch gears, go the opposite way, and say, no, I won't even look at your spirit until I've seen your flesh? That's what's being taught by people who say that male rules over female. But that's a side issue today. I have a whole series and a book on that topic. Then he gets to picking the last, the youngest, the sheep herder. And that's the one God chose because of his spirit. Now, this thing about Saul. Saul had done evil. He had been chosen by God to be the first king reluctantly because God said, I'm your king. You have priests and prophets. And they said, no, we want a king like everybody else. And God said, this king is going to conscript your sons and make them run in front of his chariot and send them off to their death in battle. And they said, we don't care. We want a king. So God gave them a king. God is not into worldly hierarchy, but he'll work with it if he has to. And in fact, he enshrined it later with King David especially. And God works around people's faults. He does. But that wasn't his ideal. So, this thing about Saul is that this is where he, first of all, meets David and has him in his service. Well, David wasn't just a little skinny kid. Obviously, he was Saul's armor bearer and a man of valor, a fighting man. And we'll see more about him in the next chapter. But this is something important about David and about Saul. These were not little people, as we'll see. And so now let's look at chapter 17. I'm going to stop and go over some of my notes. There's chapter 17. David was described as a man of valor in 16:18. In 17, we'll see also that he killed animals like lions and bears with his bare hands. And as armor bearer for Saul, think about this. Saul, according to 1 Samuel 10:23 and 24, which we haven't read and won't be going over today, was head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel. So what was the average height of men in Israel at that time? From what I could gather, and I did some looking around, it was about 5.5 feet tall. That was an average man height in Israel in the days of Saul and David. Around 5.5 feet. So if Saul was head and shoulders above that, he was easily another foot and a half taller. That would have made him about 6.5 feet tall. That's a huge man in those days. Okay? And David was his armor bearer. Think about that. How small could David be? And how young could David be? You don't send kids out to battle bearing the king's armor. So, David was likely over 6 feet tall, at least. And he tried on Saul's armor, but he rejected it, not because it was too big, but because he wasn't used to it. You could see that in 1 Samuel 17. We'll see that later, because I will read through that. So he wasn't much likely to be much smaller than Saul. And the reason that we'll see that Saul doubts David's chances with Goliath will be because of inexperience, not size. And at the end of this, when David kills Goliath, he is able to pick up Goliath's sword, Goliath's own giant sword, and decapitate him with it. Now we'll see here in chapter 17 that Goliath's height was 6 cubits and a span. 6 cubits, some people say 4, I don't know where they get that. 6 cubits and a span. The standard cubit was 18 inches, that's 1.5 feet. And a span was half of a cubit. So he was 9 feet 9 inches tall, most likely. Now, of course, you can go to liberal sites, you can go to Wiki, you can go to any kind of site that is against the Bible literalism in some way, and they will always lowball every number. Okay, they'll lowball everything, especially things like this that seem out of the norm. They will lowball it to try to make it naturalistic and dismiss miracles and things that weren't as they are now. Everybody wants to make the past identical to the present, and this is not true. So let's read through 17. Now the Philistines, the enemies of Israel, after which the name Palestine comes. Palestina is what the Romans called it, and it was named after the Philistines, who were the mortal enemies of Israel, and the reasons the Romans did that was to humiliate the conquered people of Israel. That's where the name Palestinian came from. Palestine was a pejorative term, a term of mockery given against the people of Israel when their area was conquered by the Romans, and so they called it after the Philistines. The Philistines had gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between these two places, Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. So this was standard prep for battle in those days. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out from the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. Well, how much is that? Let's just go down and look at the footnote instead of clicking that little pop-up. Okay, I think that was B, 125 pounds or 58 kilograms. The tip of the spear we can see on C there is going to be 15 pounds or 6.9 kilograms. So these are big things here. Okay, let's go back up. Let's see. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and those are things that protect your shins, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. The shield bearer carried this stuff, a lot of the stuff that he wasn't wearing at the time. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. I'm just going to stop here for a second and remember a scene from, I think I've mentioned this in other videos of mine before, a scene from Achilles with Brad Pitt playing Achilles. And there's a spot in the movie where the different armies, of course, are lined up to do this exact same thing, where they want to choose their champion and have the champions battle, and that will decide the war instead of everybody fighting. And Achilles couldn't be bothered to go out to war that day, so they had to send a boy back to camp to get him and wake him up. And the boy said that this champion of the other army was the biggest man he'd ever seen, and he wouldn't want to fight him. And Achilles says, "That's why no one will remember your name." And I keep thinking of that with the Christian community, not wanting to go to battle spiritually as the Bible commands. And this is why no one will remember them. This is why no one knows who they are. And sometimes you wonder if Jesus knows who they are, because they show no signs of life and no courage. Anyway, this is what they were doing. They were terrified of Goliath. And even Saul, who was well taller than anybody else in the army, was afraid. So Goliath was taller than Saul, who was at least 6.5 feet tall. So Goliath was not just 6.5 feet tall. They wouldn't have been afraid of him. Down to verse 12. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judea. So evidently some significant time had passed between chapters 16 and 17. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's sheep in Bethlehem. Why was he going back and forth from Saul? Because he was playing the lyre for Saul and carrying his armor. So Saul knew David, but enough time had passed, there wasn't a lot of details he remembered, okay? For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. This went on for quite a long time. Well, it's over a month. Now Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah, or measure of roasted grain, and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are doing, and bring back some assurance from them. There was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. So early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. And as he was talking to them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage, and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So he knew, but this was just how you did things in the day, and saying, what'll I get for this? What'll I get for this? In other words, he's saying, I'm volunteering. Okay? Then they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. In other words, they presumed his motives. I think this should sound very familiar to a lot of Christians, especially who have their motives presumed, often by other Christians. You only want this. You're just doing this because of that motive. They presume these things. And this is, keep in mind, this David is someone that God anointed for this purpose. They didn't know that. God didn't need to tell them, but they presumed wrongly. And they were his older brothers, and they thought they had the right to presume wrongly, but there are times when even age and experience don't help you, although it certainly is something there's too little respect for these days. But in this case, they were quite wrong. It's never good, never wise to presume motives. Now what have I done, said David. Can't I even speak? How many times have I said that? And a lot of other people I know have said that. He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. So by spreading around these questions, he got the king's attention, even though he was Saul's armor bearer. Saul wasn't always the brightest bulb or had the best memory, and keep in mind that he also had been periodically sent a disturbing spirit from God for defying God's will, and you can read that earlier in Samuel. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Your servant being like myself, being very proper and humble, before the king. Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." In other words, he's talking about, this is the part where he's saying, you're too inexperienced. You've been an armor bearer, but you haven't been in battle. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came out and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of the shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. Now, this is where people say he must have been a little boy. But no, he wasn't, but he was just young. Okay? But he wasn't little. You don't send a young boy as your armor bearer. But because of his appearance, Goliath despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Because David was carrying a staff. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." That's a good lesson there. As the Bible says elsewhere, where "vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. And we are not to take our own vengeance. But nonetheless, even though the battle belongs to God, he does send us out to do something to do with these battles. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. These slings, if nobody knows, this is not the typical Western slingshot. This is a long leather strap with a little pouch-like thing in it, and you put the stone in there and you swung it around your head and then released it. And I've seen videos of people today getting really good with that sling, and you can kill somebody. It's almost like shooting a gun. You're hurling a projectile, this case a rock, at high speed, and it says it hit Goliath, this giant, hard enough in the forehead to sink in. So he was basically shot between the eyes. So David, it says in verse 50, triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him without a sword. So Goliath was dead already. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath because he didn't have his own sword. But this was the sword of a giant, and David picked it up and cut off his head with the sword. And then, of course, the rest of the chapter, when the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sheraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistine's weapons in his own tent. In other words, that was his loot from what he had accomplished. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" So this is what I was talking about with Saul not having the best memory. Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." So he wasn't told about all the time that David had come back and forth or bore his armor. apparently. I don't know. The king said, find out whose son this young man is, because obviously he had promises to keep, like exempting his family from taxes. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. Whose son are you, young man? He asked him. David said, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. So that's the account of David and Goliath, not the soundbite versions you usually hear in message boards and rolling chats. So David was not small, Saul was not small, and both of them were afraid of Goliath, who was even less small. Goliath was over 9 feet tall, close to 10. Saul was about 6.5 feet tall. David was probably about the same size. Maybe he was smaller. It doesn't say he was totally head and shoulders over him or anything, but, by the clues given in the text, he couldn't have been less than about 6 feet tall, which was still taller than average in Israel. So these are the facts about that account, as opposed to what you will read in the Bible hate sites and the out-of-context cherry-picking sites. Now let's look at some of the women of the Bible, and we're going to go to Judges 4. Let me get that out. And, I think that's cut off from the screen a little bit. Hope I didn't move that over too far. I shouldn't have moved it. It was just the other title at the top. Okay. Let's read about Deborah. And we're going to note some things. We'll read through the chapter and make some comments. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in some place I'm not even going to try to pronounce, because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried out to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She was a judge, and I'm going to look at this footnote. Judging. The only reason they put leading there instead of judging is because this is a woman and they can't abide a woman having the same judging authority as all the other judges who were serving in the place of kings at that time. And the fact is, it's the same word. She was a judge in Israel like any other of the judges. She was judging Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah, a palm named after her, between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Binoam from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, she sent for Barak, she sent for this guy. She summoned him. She said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands. Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I will not go. Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now let me stop for just a second. So this Deborah is a judge, a literal judge, and also the leader of Israel. And she got commands from God just like any other prophet, as you saw in verse 6, where she was telling a message from the Lord. Let's back up there a second. She sent for Barak and said, the Lord of God of Israel commands you. So she had a message from God, and she gave it to this guy. But he wouldn't go without her. He would not go to battle without her. So, what does that say about Barak? Now, people are going to try to think this is God's, dealing with a cowardly man and had to choose a woman for that reason, but let's read on. Okay, so they went out to battle, and Deborah went with him. And there's a little side note here. This is going to be important. Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in some other than in near Kadesh. So there's a relative, one of the Israelites who was in the area. Now, when they told Sisera, the enemy king, that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned all his men and 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down, so she gave him the order, and he went down to Mount Tabor with the 10,000. And at Barak's advice, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. This is the king of the army, got out of his chariot and ran. Barak pursued the chariots and the army to a certain distance and killed all the troops. Not one man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Remember, we just read about him. Because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. So that's why this guy was kind of an outlier of the people of Israel, and he went off and made an alliance of his own, and Sisera knew about it and went there for safety. Okay? The woman, Jael, went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I am thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. And then Barak comes along, and Jael went to meet him, said, "Come and I'll show you the man you're looking for," and showed him dead on the ground, pinned to the ground with a tent peg. So there's a couple of things to learn from this story. First of all, the ladies among us need to remember this the next time somebody says, "Be a biblical, godly woman." That includes, as there's a meme that we've had on a previous video of Jesus driving the merchants from the temple, flipping tables and chasing people with a whip. Here's a godly woman. Picture this with her driving a tent peg through an enemy's temples and pinning him to the ground. So there's a godly woman. She conquered an enemy king, and just as Deborah predicted, the glory of defeating the enemy king went to a woman. And in case anybody thinks that God only used these women because the men were being wimpy, consider another woman named Huldah. You can read about her in a couple of passages, one being 2 Kings 22 and the other being 2 Chronicles 34. She was also called a prophet. Her husband was the wardrobe keeper of the king. So her husband minded the clothing and fashion of the king, and she was the prophet. Okay, her name was Huldah. One of the men who was sent to get God's command from Huldah was the father of the prophet Jeremiah. You can read about this in 2 Chronicles 35:25. Okay, so she was summoned by the king for God's commands. And one of the people sent to get her was the father of the prophet Jeremiah. So God was not scraping the bottom of the barrel. And it is believed, from what I could find, that also the prophets Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk were also living then and within a reasonable distance of Jerusalem or Judea, the area there. So God was not scraping the bottom of the barrel. He chose these women, and they spoke for him, "Thus saith the Lord." And there are other women that should be noted in the Bible as well. And I have a whole series called You Are One about a lot of these things. We also have Miriam, the sister of Moses, and you can read about her in Exodus 15 and Micah 6. She was called a leader in Israel alongside Moses. You never hear that because most preachers are men. Then in the New Testament, we have a lot of women. One was Junia in Romans 16:7. She was called outstanding among the apostles. And I have an article I can link to anybody who wants to know where I get this stuff. There was one by an author who has a PhD in theology who vouches for this fact that she was an apostle herself and outstanding among them, not simply known to them. Okay? So if nobody wants to listen to my research, they can listen to somebody with a PhD in theology, which even most men don't have. And that article, I will put in the description as well, exposes also the deliberate gender bender of Junia by biased controllers of official Greek text. So it's an important link that you want to check out about how they tried to turn Junia into a man just because the Bible clearly states that this person was an apostle. Then we have Phoebe in Romans, also in Romans 16, who is called a deacon in the church at Cenchrea, a benefactor of many, including Paul. Okay, the word is deacon, diakonos, the masculine form. There was no feminine form at first. And everywhere else in most English translations, that word is translated minister. They only made an exception here when a fallacy called special pleading because the person is a woman. So they said she can't be a minister, we'll call her a servant. That's lying. That's twisting the word of God. That's altering the word of God when they do that. Then we have Priscilla. You can read about her in Acts, who co-taught Apollos, who was no ordinary person. He was quite prominent. And she taught others. She ran a business, and she likely wrote the letter to the Hebrews. And in, I think it was 1899, a guy named Adolf von Harnack, a German, obviously, and certainly in a very patriarchal society in that culture and time, decided that the author of Hebrews had to have been a woman because of what he calls a conspiracy of silence. No author is listed. This is highly unusual, especially in the New Testament, and especially by Paul, who made a point of signing every letter because there was a forgery problem you can read about in 2 Thessalonians. So Hebrews was not signed, and it talks in the third person about people who had seen the Lord, and Paul had seen the Lord, so it was not written by Paul, and in all likelihood written by a woman, and probably Phoebe, or probably Priscilla, I'm sorry. And then there are also women in the Bible such as Esther, Ruth, Rebecca, Noadiah, you don't know who she is, Anna, Rachel, Hannah, Abigail, Philip's 4 daughters in the New Testament, who were prophets, Dorcas, Lydia, Elizabeth, Mary, the sister of Lazarus, who sat at Jesus' feet as any rabbinical student, also Mary Magdalene, who anointed Jesus for his impending death and burial, and the hypothetical woman of Proverbs 31, who was a businesswoman with employees and cited for her wisdom. And then what about Eve, the mother of all the living, through whose seed the Messiah would come? She was truly the help that Adam needed. The seed would be born without the involvement of any man. How does that not honor Eve? Or Mary, the woman through whom this prophecy was fulfilled? And I will list in the description all these references to these women of the New Testament that I just mentioned. So, women in the Bible are also portrayed as warriors, every bit as brave as the men. And David was not a skinny little teenager. And Goliath was not just a mere basketball player size. He was bigger than any of them today. So those are the facts. If you want facts, you look at the Bible and read it yourself. If you want hearsay and feel-good, ear-tickling religion, you can go to the astrotheologists and the liberal theologists and the bloggers and get your information from them. The choice is yours, and as always, thanks for listening.